Signum Academy. This is Wesley, and we're in February now, the first Monday of February. And so, I wanted to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien this month. His Fellowship of the Ring, the sequel to The Hobbit, and it's also a little more than that. It's incorporates a lot of his interests in Old English and in old texts in general. And so we're going to look at that aspect of the book a little bit as well today. Cool. All right. I think I've got the title on here this time. And I guess as people pop in, I'll try to check out the chat and catch up on whatever comments and questions you guys have. I'll be the first to say I'm not a super expert on Tolkien. I'm a student of him in some ways, and a big fan of his work. But as far as all of the information that's out there that there is to know about Tolkien, I'm only scratching the surface. I haven't read most of the history of Middle-earth volumes that Christopher Tolkien, his son, put together, that bring in all of the stuff that he was working on and all the stages of his development of the ideas that would become The Hobbit, The Fellowship of the Ring, and especially the Silmarillion. And so that's outside of my knowledge. If you know more about things as I'm talking here today, if you know more about what I'm talking about than I do, please drop a line, drop a comment there in the chat, or shoot an email to academy@signumu.org. Just to back up a little bit here, and I'll try to project the slides. We looked last time at what Signum Academy is, what it's supposed to be, a place for lovers of books and stories to come together and share their knowledge, to dig deeper into these books and get to know other fans. That's it in a nutshell. This is through Signum Academy, where you can find way more information about Tolkien and Lewis and all these topics that we're going to talk about here. They have some great programs for course credit. If that's something that you're looking into, that's where you want to go, Signum University. If you are just a fan and love reading this stuff and want to talk to other people, sorry, my cats I think they're fighting off some invaders out there, the neighbor cats. If you just want to talk to other people who love this stuff, other fans, then Mythgard Institute and the Academy courses, they're completely free and open to anybody. That's the way to go. If you're a young reader or young at heart like me, readers of all ages, that's what we are up to here at Signum Academy, is bringing people together and sharing our love of these books. And we talked about some of the different ways we've done that in the past, different summer camps, and some of the new programs that we're hoping to run in the future. Tutoring and crafty activities and enrichment for any teachers out there, things you can do in your classroom to bring these books to life. There's a website for all of that at signumu.org/academy. Again, please send us emails through there, or get in touch if you need any materials. So for kids and readers of all ages out there, the Fellowship of the Ring can be intimidating at first. As I projected this image last time, a lot of fantasy series now, the books are more or less the same length, each one. Usually the first one's a little shorter, sure. That's just the way it goes, I guess. And even if the books later in the series get a little bigger, like J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter books, for example. Philip Pullman's books do this too. The third one is huge. The new one that just came out is really long. But generally, it's not going to be that huge of a leap in terms of what you're reading from one book to the next one in the series. And Tolkien, in many ways, Tolkien is the first, modern fantasy series that gained popularity, that made this a thing. But Tolkien's different in a lot of ways. His first book in the series, quote unquote, is really originally intended to just be one book by itself. The Hobbit wasn't planned to be the start of this huge, long story. It's only because it is unexpectedly so popular that Tolkien goes back and starts to write, what he thinks of as a sequel to it. And if you look at that history of Middle-earth, you'll see that takes a lot of different directions. And actually, Tolkien talks about this too in his foreword to The Fellowship of the Ring. And we'll look at that a little bit here. So again, I had meant last time to look up and find where this picture actually came from, because I didn't make it. I found it easily enough, again, through just Googling, fantasy series images or something. It looks like it comes from Pinterest, and I actually took the image from a website called fatherly.com. So I can't vouch for those places, but just so you know, that's where I got this one, in case you wanted to find it. The quote that I put here, I just typed up out of my book. It's the old paperback edition. Mine, my books are old. They're destroyed. Just like my dad's old Hobbit book. This one's fallen apart. I'll hold it together with a rubber band, but it's handy because then I can use the cover as a bookmark. And this edition has got these page numbers if you want to find where these things are. So the quote I picked to kind of start us off here, one I like to think about, a couple, I guess. If only that dratted wizard will leave young Frodo alone, perhaps he'll settle down and grow some hobbit sense, they said. A page later, some folk have all the luck, they said. Now, the first thing I notice about these two is that they seem to not quite agree with one another. In the first one, they're saying that Frodo is struggling in this fashion. He's got this person, this dratted wizard, who keeps stirring him up, right? And he won't settle down, and he doesn't have enough hobbit sense. Something like common sense, I guess, for hobbits. But a page later, they're saying some folk have all the luck. They're talking again about the same person, but now it's totally flipped around. They're jealous of him. Or at least they think there's something kind of lucky about him. The other question that comes to mind, besides what makes them completely change their opinion apparently and not really notice it, the other question is who they are. Who are they? Who is saying all this about Frodo? It's never really explained. I don't mean this as a question like, there's a right answer to this question, I want you to tell me, it's a quiz. It's not like that. These are the kind of questions that we just can wonder about, because I don't think that the book makes it super clear, and I think that we're left then to wonder, and that's intentional. You notice that Tolkien does this from the very first paragraph of the sequel to The Hobbit. By the time the book finally gets going in chapter 1, the first paragraph, it's not as great maybe as The Hobbit's famous opening, but it's still pretty good. Chapter 1, a long expected party, as opposed to the unexpected party in The Hobbit. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11th birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. So, from the beginning, we have this kind of setup where we're hearing all about these amazing events and this strange person Bilbo and his strange relative Frodo. And we're hearing about it from the talk in town, in Hobbiton. we're left sort of unsure about these matters. Even if we've read The Hobbit and we know what happened, suddenly the things that happened in that story are made a little bit more questionable because no one else seems to really know the truth. And in the original version of the book, supposedly, Bilbo himself twisted or told a half-truth about some of the events in his adventure. So there's kind of an interesting setup to making us part of this community of people who don't really know what's going on and are really curious and want to find out, want to go to the party, and want to be close to the action. This is not like many other fantasy books. Usually we get a pretty clear main character that we're kind of dialed in on their experiences and what they're feeling and seeing and wondering. And we get there in The Fellowship of the Ring, the first book. And then throughout The Lord of the Rings, we sort of move around between very strong lenses, we'll say, different ways of seeing the story through different characters' eyes. We will get there. But when we start out and we're sort of just entering into this world again, it is by no means clear who is talking to us, who's telling us what's going on, and whether they really know or not. It's a fun way into the story, I think. And maybe you know the story so well at this point, you don't even really notice that anymore. But it's there. I think it's important to pick up on it. So yeah, just to give a little bit of an overview then. A couple of opening questions for people out there is about the Lord of the Rings, right? And this is the first book, Fellowship of the Ring. Here's a clearer picture, I hope. Mine is kind of falling apart. And on the back, you've got a picture of the author looking really cool with his pipe and his college behind him, I guess, somewhere in where he's teaching in Oxford. My questions to start out: what do you like best about these books? Or about any books, the fantasy books you read? Do you like best the world, that fantasy world that they create? Or do you like the story? What's happening, right? You want to know what happens next. That's maybe, you can like both of them, sure. I hope you would. If you're going to keep reading a book, you got to like where you are and you've got to like what's happening there. But maybe you kind of, when you look at these two things and try to see what's different about them, maybe you can say that you like one better than the other. I don't know. Personally, I have always kind of liked fantasy worlds. I can sometimes forget a lot I can forget about the story, but I'll remember pretty clearly what it felt like to be in that world of the book. That's what has to grab me and pull me in, or else I'm not going to stick with it, even if it's a great story. If it's super suspenseful and interesting. If I'm not captivated by the world where that story is set, then I tend to lose my place and lose my interest. So there's actually maybe one more candidate thinking about Tolkien, the kind of writer he is again. Very intelligent, very steeped in old books. A great student of language, of the English language and all the languages that it grew out of. Maybe what you like best is actually the words, not the world, the words that create the world and the story. Maybe there's particular words, I don't know, like 11T first has a nice ring to it, right? Or even there lived a hobbit. A hobbit. You just like the sound of these words, maybe. Or the way they sound together. He's an incredibly poetic author, Tolkien. I think this is a point that our Tolkien professor, Dr. Olson, likes to make too. he makes it better than I will. But just to say, Tolkien's poetry is really underrated. It's really ignored by a lot of readers, to put it bluntly. And I'm guilty of this too. The first time I read these books as a kid, I didn't get a lot of what was going on, and I especially didn't get a lot of the poems. And so, my goal, or one of my goals, as I'm rereading these with you guys out there, is to put some support, whatever I can do to help the poems hit home for you a little bit more, and so you can see what's going on in there. What is he up to? Why is he including them? And how important they are for the story. It's incredibly important. Poetry for Tolkien is a way of casting spells. If you remember back a few weeks, we talked about, seers and scribes and spells, all these ways that books get passed on and have this kind of power to them. Well, poetry, before there was any book, there was poetry that was recited and passed on by word of mouth, and remembered that way. The magical thing about the poem is not just that it creates an image or tells a story, but that it retains that information and puts it into language and survives. Remember this idea of how books get passed down and survive. Before there was any book, the stories had to survive, the words had to, and of course they change over time, but like a game of telephone, right? You whisper one thing, and by the time it gets back around to you, it's something totally different. But there's some part of it that's retained, right? That's inspiring the telling. That's the form of it. The maybe an image, maybe a character, whatever it is, that gives rise to the poem and creates new words, a new form for thought to survive in. Anyway, we'll look at some poems here. Let me check back and see. Hey, okay. A lot of chatting has happened. I hope that I'm able to catch up a little bit of what's been said. Oops. Now it went away. Is there some way to go back in this chat? Okay. Yeah, I'm not picking up on those. Sorry. I don't know what you guys are talking about, but it sounds interesting, and it sounds like it's part of another conversation. If you've got questions for the Signum Academy side of things, pop back in with them. Yeah, the dratted old wizard. Oh, you are talking to me. Okay, yeah, the wizard. Sorry. The wizard. Yeah, their concern isn't 100% earnest, Juice Rock says. They dislike Gandalf, but see that Bilbo and or Frodo benefit from their relationship with the wizard. Okay. And then Dolberon, you're saying the Hobbit on the Bywater omnibus, perhaps. Yeah, I'm not picking up what that's a reference to. The Bywater's the river, right? Sorry, yeah. But yeah, I think I agree with Juice there. The concern is maybe not entirely like serious, right? That they really are worried about Frodo, but they're more sort of annoyed that Gandalf is leading him astray, and he's not like other hobbits, right? All right, I've got another couple pictures here that are a little different, and this one's a Wikipedia sourced image. This is the one that pops up if you search for J.R.R. Tolkien. You want to know more about his life and stuff like that. This is him as a young man in the army, right, during World War I. The other image here is his design. because he's an artist as well as a scholar as well as a writer. He made some designs for his books, how he wanted them to look, sort of, and these were never used when the books first came out. But there's new editions now that have got versions of his designs for the story, for the cover. Sorry, and this one is pretty creepy. I think anyway. It really pulls your attention where I guess Tolkien intended it to be, which is on the ring. Right? He's got his language and his script all around it, and in the middle what looks like an eye looking at you, and then another one of the rings that's opposed, and the other two, the three elven rings opposed and yet drawn to the one ring, right? So when you think about who's telling the story, who is this they? Well, it's the other hobbits. They're concerned about Frodo, or they're annoyed by the wizard, or they just want some of his treasure that they think is there in his hill, whatever it might be. In some sense, they are the voices that we're getting, but in a way, of course, Tolkien is telling the story, right? He's the author. He's creating everything, surely, right? It's all at least passing through him, maybe a better way, right? He talks about how this is a kind of soil in which the seeds of stories grow. Other places, I think he talks about it as a kind of compost heap, right? All of the different things that he's taken in, all the different stories over his life and his experiences, and in that kind of rich soil, these stories just come up, and he's just transmitting them, right? In his other great essay, I think that's something that's quoted in the biography, probably, but in his great essay on fairy stories, if you ever get a chance, you should totally check out the On Fairy Stories essay. He talks about, on fairy stories, this as a children's room, right? The nursery room where the kids go to play and maybe have lessons or something, and all these kind of dusty old toys and old furniture gets kind of chucked into the nursery once the kids have grown out of it, and it's not really respected, right? So these stories, they have this living quality to them, and they also have this quality of being in some way neglected, or people don't give them the attention they really deserve. He talks about it also as a stew, right? A sort of a cauldron with all these different ingredients in it, and you can try to pull out the different ingredients, but you're not going to be able to. You really want to just get the flavor of the stew all together, right? So there's lots of different ways to think about that. But in no sense does he claim responsibility, like he made it all up, right? He's pretty clear that he's getting this from a lot of different places. And he even goes so far as to talk about it as not creation, but sub-creation, right? He is creating in a sense, but in a way he is subject to a larger kind of creation. And for him, I think that's got a spiritual, or at least a religious, some kind of component to it, right? Creation as in creation. And so what he's doing is contributing in his way to that, but by no means is he really in charge of the whole thing. And so I think it's interesting. Again, I think the more you think about it, the more interesting it gets, that we get this story through sort of silly country bumpkin kind of people, and these kind of shrewd and cunning townspeople, and in all cases through the hobbits primarily. And this is a point that others have made, but most of the story is told from the perspective not of the great warriors, not of the wizard and the elves and the king, but is told from the perspective of these little friends, the Fellowship. They're the core of it, and they're the ones who we mostly are along with for the ride. And yeah, I think that's really, really cool. That as we kind of home in on what's going on, we come through these discussions, right, of the gossip in town, all the different versions of the story. And okay, before we even get to the story, we have all these different voices, right? These different perspectives. The very first thing you see when you open the book, there's a little kind of blurb by Peter Beagle, but there's the poem. The first thing you see, really, The Lord of the Rings, is this poem. Should I read the poem? I'm just going to read the poem because, yeah, I love this poem. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Great setting the scene. And that poem, of course, pops back in a couple chapters into the story. That dreaded wizard shows us that it's part of it is around the ring, and then tells us the rest. Then we get the foreword, like a word before the story starts, from the author, from Tolkien. He's talking to us. He tells us the tale grew in the telling. So this is, again, not really his intention, but as he was telling the story, it grew on him. He was compelled to follow it and make it this big thing. And that forward is super interesting. There's a lot there. I don't want to go into it too much. But man, yeah, he has some really interesting points about his own story and about the art, really, of storytelling and where stories come from in there. Then we come to the prologue, okay? Table of contents, the map. We'll look at the map a little bit, or part of the map. The prologue is long. Before we even get to the story, 20, 30 pages of prologue material. It tells us about hobbits, and about the Hobbit, right? The story that he already told. Now, this isn't, Tolkien talking anymore. This seems to be some editor or historian persona, or this other figure is telling this part of the story. Right? He's acting like hobbits are real. Maybe they are. I don't know. But they've diminished. They've gone into hiding. They've faded, just like all the other magical elements of the story. And part of this, again, is kind of a summary about the Hobbit, the There and Back Again story, told by Bilbo, and the original version, right? Bilbo left something out. He changed something about how he got the ring, basically. And that's actually kind of interesting. That's Tolkien changing the story as he originally wrote it and making this connection so that this new story fits better with that old story. But when he makes that change, he writes it into the story. He writes it as Bilbo having changed the story because of the effect that the greed, right? The bad kind of compelling that the ring does to him, that he makes that little lie about how he gains the ring from Gollum. So we move on through the prologue. There's a note on the Shire records This is the kind of stuff that Tolkien loved. He loved making up a history for the book that we're reading. Where did this book come? Where did this version of the story come from? The Red Book and Bilbo's memoirs, that's The Hobbit, and his translations from the Elvish. That seems to be what becomes the Silmarillion. In the foreword, Tolkien is very sad because the Silmarillion, he thinks, is never going to come to light. There's no hope, right? And of course it does eventually, right, with a little bit of help from his son. But he doesn't live to see that part of the story really gain the popularity that he would have wanted. Right? The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings explode, right, beyond all his expectations. But the part that he cared most about was the legends, the myths, the language, right? The languages, rather, that he'd made up or that he'd devised, found, right, discovered. And that is all, again, worked into this version of the story. These are Bilbo's translations from Elvish of the old myths. And then there's, of course, Meriadoc, character we'll meet, who becomes a great scholar, among other things, about pipeweed, right? This kind of fun inclusion in the story. Then, after something like 40 pages, I don't know, depending on how small your font is and what version of the story you've got, then we get to book one of this long story, The Long Expected Party. So, in addition to the voices telling the story through the narrator in the book, we have all these other people. This author figure, this editor figure, historian, these scribes who've reproduced and transmitted all this material. Bilbo himself is one of the people telling the story, right? And Merry. All right. None of them, of course, wrote the poem that we read. Who wrote that poem? Who's responsible for that? Is that a fair question to ask? So we're going to look at the map in a sec here. But yeah, any thoughts about, what's your favorite part of stories? Who's responsible for these stories? I guess we lost our other discussion participants have gone their separate ways here. Well. Sometime down the line, if you have thoughts, guys, send them in. And be happy to respond. Yeah, we're doing pretty good here. Okay. So there's the big map of Middle-earth, and instead of looking at that for now, because we're not going to get that far into the story, just spending a month on Tolkien, and of course we only meet twice a month, unless there's, maybe make an exception for some kind of special event sometime. Have a secret extra meeting if there's an extra Monday. But with these two meetings, just want to kind of give an introduction. And so we're not going to get all the way into the story, but we will talk a little bit here about this map and this little part of Middle-earth, the Shire. And not all of it, just a part of the Shire, this map is called. So this version isn't exactly like the one in my book, but it's close enough. And what I like about it is the way that you can see how orderly everything is, right? How neatly this has been sort of partitioned, right, divided up, and how lovingly, this has been depicted for us. It's a really incredibly detailed bit of what we call now, right, world building, like making up a world. There is such love and care that's gone into this. We see that in a different way with the cover, which is another one of Tolkien's paintings, right, watercolors. But this map, is full of information, way more information than we could possibly need for the story, right? Just like all that stuff that we get before the story, we're never going to visit most of these places. We'll hear about stuff that happens in some of these places, things that are happening, sort of those rumors, right, that we overhear about strange things going on, but we never visit most of the Shire. We have no real need to. Hobbiton itself is just a little tiny speck on the map, and this is already zoomed way in from Middle Earth. There's the hill, right, where everything starts. We're going to go along Bywater, right, and down the water to the Brandywine. We'll make it eventually to the Old Forest, right, where strange folks, strange things, queer folks, they even say, going on over there. I'll draw your attention, though, also to the little mention here of Wood Hall, right? We'll make a detour there. And over here is the Green Hill Country. Great name, right? Green Hill Country is actually the title of a short story by one of the great scholars of Tolkien, Verlin Flieger. Verlin Flieger has written great essays and books about Tolkien and his stories and his world, his language. She's also written some stories of her own, and one of them is called Green Hill Country. And it's about this thing of where stories come from, how they get told, and how the telling of stories, changes them over time. All right. So check that out if you get the chance. You can find it in a book called Seekers of Dreams, which is a cool title too. I think it's the closing story in that collection, if I remember. So that's a cool one to check out if you're interested in that sort of thing. But yeah, when I picked up this book as a kid, and I wasn't really able to understand a lot of the story, I still was drawn in by these maps, by seeing the kind of forests and rivers and all the little tiny names of places that just seem they're full of they're full of the beginnings of stories, right, that you can develop yourself if you want. That's something that these books bring us in a way, right, to be involved in this process of sub-creation. So that's what we'll actually talk more about next time, is the idea of fan fiction, right? Making up your own story within an existing world, developing something new to happen there, new characters, new events. I think that the maps always kind of made me want to do that particularly. So those many voices that tell the story we saw, they all are, human or hobbit. They're mortal. They're like us in some ways, right? But of course, part of what makes these books, so fantastic in all senses of the word, part of what makes them what they are, is that it's not just people like us, right? People we can sort of relate to, if you like. There's also really strange, really magical people in these worlds that are involved in the stories too. There's that ring poem, right, that's so mysterious and has such a haunting quality to it. There's elves, right? One of the first things we hear about when we meet Sam for the first time, right, is that he is super interested in elves. He is elves and dragons, as his dad tells him, right? Cabbages and potatoes, Sam, is what you should focus on. But he's all full. His head is full of these stories of elves and dragons that he's gotten from old Mr. Bilbo. And there's things that are stranger than them too, right? Famously, when you get to the Old Forest, you'll meet Tom Bombadil, right? Classic J.R.R. Tolkien kind of trivia questions, revolve around who is Tom Bombadil? Who is Tom Bombadil? He is the master, as we learn. But what does that mean, right? And this character Tom Bombadil comes from the other poems and the other studies, if you like, that Tolkien is involved with. He takes from all kinds of places to build up the stock and the stew that becomes the Lord of the Rings. Some of that is from his own mythology that he's creating, subcreating. Some of that is from his languages. And then there's other bits and pieces that get worked in. And if you come to the Fellowship of the Ring and you come to the Lord of the Rings through the movies, right, that are so great in their own way, there's certain parts that just get cut out, and that they have to, right? They can't possibly include everything the way Tolkien includes everything. And of course, Tom Bombadil doesn't make the cut in the movies. Some of his lines do, right? Some of the kind of thing that he's there accomplishing gets reworked into other characters, like I think like Treebeard, right? But there's something so strange about Tom Bombadil. He's always stuck with me as one of my favorite things about these books. As much as I love, Sam, and as much as I love the poetry and the way that the story is told, all that, themes of good and evil, of fading, right, of what happens to even good things after they have struggled and fought the good fight, right? Like this idea of death that seems like is worked into that image of the green hill country, right? The far green country. There's some deep stuff in this book, but one of the things that's always stuck with me somehow is Tom Bombadil. He's just so cool. I just think he's so cool. And so if you research, for those of you out there who really want to get into this and find out the answer to this question, right? Who is Tom Bombadil? If you research some of Tolkien's, the things that he has said and the things that others have been able to turn up, like these editors, Skull and Hammond, there's a lot of material actually out there that you can read more about where Tom Bombadil comes from. One of the main sources, maybe the main source, right, is this idea. I wrote it here as the genius loci, the spirit, the little magical emanation of the place, right? The creative power, if you like, of the place. In some sense, and I forget if he's writing this to his publisher or somebody, Tolkien writes that the Tom Bombadil is a kind of spirit of the countryside, of his countryside, Tolkien's in England, right? In some way, this corner of Middle-earth, at least, the Shire, the Old Forest, all of that, in some way that is Tolkien's, idealized version of his home, of England, right? Of his England. And Tom Bombadil is a kind of personification of that spirit of the countryside. To me, that is really, really fascinating. I have always been, inspired. When I sit down to write, right, I talked about how I struggle with this, but when I do, It's because usually there's something in the place where I am that's inspiring me, that I'm kind of getting an image, getting an idea for a story from something about the feel of the place. And I can't really explain it any better than that, but I hope you know what I mean. This might be your home, right, where you're from, that is kind of in your bones, that you feel in that deep way. Or it could be a place that you go to that's new, right, but that you feel like there's something there that needs to be told, that needs to be shared. So when you travel, I don't know, when I travel, I get really inspired, because everything's kind of new, and you're learning. Or maybe it's a place that you go in your imagination, right, or in your dreams, that kind of a place, right? That's the kind of place where stories happen, surely. And so this idea of Tom Bombadil as the spirit of the place, as the genius, the creative power, is what that word kind of means at its root. It's no surprise then that when Tom Bombadil speaks, he sort of speaks in a poetic form. Right? If you listen close, if you read it out loud, or if you kind of look at the way that he talks, you will definitely hear that poetic quality. And he even teaches them some poetry, right, to summon him if they need him, right? He teaches them bits of the songs that he's continually singing. If you look at the Silmarillion, just to glance at that a little tiny bit, the whole world of Middle-earth is brought into being by a song. And so this is a kind of little miniature version of that, right? In some way, this whole book starts with that little poem about the ring, right? That's the thing that Tolkien takes from his other story, The Hobbit, to develop into this much bigger story. That's the connection. That's the link that he finds. And that, I mean, when you think about the ring that way, that's really interesting, right? That it has a kind of hold, a compelling power. It pulls you in. That's tough. I won't spoil, but my thoughts run away with me at that point. Maybe you're thinking some interesting things about it too. But if you are interested in Tom Bombadil, you can find more about him in this book, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. There's this other one too, which has got effectively the exact same cover, called The Tolkien Reader. And this one's maybe a little easier to find, I don't know. I was able to find a copy at a used bookstore not too long ago. And I've always wanted a copy of this book because it has got that On Fairy Stories essay that's so interesting. It's great. It's got some other little stories in it, Farmer Giles and Leaf by Niggle, which are cool, short stories. If you're a Tolkien completionist, you're definitely going to want to know about those. And it has a version of these poems in here. The Adventures of Tom Bombadil and Other Verses from the Red Book, this is called, with these delightful illustrations by Pauline Baines. Great illustrator. And of course, in front of the poems, you get a preface. Right? Tolkien can't help himself. He's got to explain where these poems came from. And so a lot of them, it seems, come through the same transmission as the Lord of the Rings, right? These are kind of collected all together in that red book, and some of the poems are said to be devised by some of our characters, right? Written by Bilbo and Sam and Frodo. They are, of course, written by Tolkien in a way too, and he sort of adapts some of his early poems from when he's pretty young, and he develops them over the course of his whole life. He's like rewriting these poems. There's that kind of survival too, right? This thing that you're bringing as a memory from your earliest childhood and carrying with you all through your life, right? That's one way that poems, if stories, get passed on too. So there's a lot there. If you really want to study this kind of stuff, that can be a really great place to look. I think that's a rich source of research and of possible essays and talks and stuff like that. If you really want to study this, the poetry is a great place to start. Obviously, Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor, has some great talks on it. Scholars like Verlin Flieger, like Tom Shippey, another big one if you want to look at some of Tolkien's early stuff, what his childhood and his early life were like. There's of course the Carpenter biography I mentioned, but also the Garth. Is that his name? Garth has the Great War book, which is kind of a major. And these are, I'm sure there's newer things that I'm not as tuned in to, but there's a lot of great resources out there. I'm talking to you older students now, if you're out there. But hey, I thought maybe we could just think a little bit about how these stories all kind of fit together then, and how they, might be connected to a place. So just to read a little bit of this version of the story, not the whole thing. The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. Old Tom Bombadil was a merry fellow. Bright blue his jacket was, and his boots were yellow. Green were his girdle, and his breeches all of leather. He wore in his tall hat a swan-wing feather. He lived up Underhill, where the withy Windle ran from a grassy well down into the dingle. Old Tom in summer-time walked about the meadows, gathering the buttercups, running after shadows, tickling the bumblebees that buzzed among the flowers, sitting by the waterside for hours upon hours. There his beard dangled long down into the water. Up came Goldberry, the river woman's daughter, pulled Tom's hanging hair. In he went a-wallowing under the water lilies, bubbling and a-swallowing. "Hey, Tom Bombadil, whither are you going?" said fair Goldberry. "Bubbles are you blowing, frightening the finny fish and the brown water rat, startling the dabchicks and drowning your feather hat." I can't keep a straight face. I'm sorry. I just think the bounciness to those lines, right? It totally encapsulates Tom Bombadil. It tells us all we need to know in some way about who this guy is. And when you get close to him, you sort of take that in as well, right? There's delightful remarks that the Tolkien professor has in his book too, exploring the Hobbit. He talks about the elf songs in that book. It's easy to brush them off, not take them too seriously, but if you really look at them and think about what they're doing, and think about it in these terms, insofar as they are kind of spirit, right? A voice of this place, this imaginary world of Tolkien's that's speaking for us to hear in a language we can understand, right? He's translated it for us, or somebody has. There's an incredible delight in living, in the activity of storytelling and exploring this world that comes through in those. I just think that there is so much to discover by looking and reading and hearing, right? Putting it into a living voice with these poems and these stories. So whether you're reading this book for the first time, that is the Fellowship of the Ring, whether this is the 10th, 20th, I don't know how many time for you, whether you've encountered that other stuff I've mentioned in the Tolkien Reader and those other scholars before, whether you have or not, whether you're getting, the amazing experience of having someone read this book out loud to you, maybe that's what's going on where you are, then you're very lucky, because that's a great way to get the story. I've trying to kind of do my small part in reading it out loud for you. I won't, of course, read the whole thing. You can find that too if you like hearing stories and reading along or just listening. There's great audio versions of all these books out there. Gosh, yeah, time has flown today. I always love bringing people back to the beginnings of this book, because I think that, of course, the story changes dramatically from the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring until we get into, the Two Towers and the Return of the King and all of the developments beyond, into the appendices, back into the Silmarillion, right? It grows and grows and grows. But in some sense, it's all there, right? It's all there in his foreword, in his prologue, in The Hobbit, and in these first 2, 3, 4 chapters. There is an incredible, as much as people have tried to imitate, right, or have tried to do their own version of this, I don't think there's anyone quite like Tolkien, right? I can understand why people are so passionate about Tolkien and him as the great fantasy author. Like I said, he's not my favorite. Like, I have other authors that I like more, and I have other stories and worlds that I like more than this one. I'll confess that up front. And I think I know more about some of the other books that we'll talk about. Actually, I've read them more recently, for one thing, and maybe possibly in greater detail than these. But Tolkien is incredible. He is a genius, right, in that creative sense, and a very humble, right, a very always trying to point us back to all of the places he took his ideas from, helping us to encounter some of those things for ourselves. And so that's what we're going to look at next time. All right. Along with Tolkien, we're going to view as much as we can some of his favorite things to read, which means that we're going to look at some old material, Old English, and possibly some Old Norse or Gothic or something else. Who knows? Maybe some Finnish, right? Some other languages that Tolkien was passionate about, that he sort of studied and drew on his knowledge of how language worked when he was making his stories in his languages, and his fan fictions too. So we're going to look a little bit next time at the whole idea of fan fiction, of telling a story in another world. Cool. I appreciate your attention, guys, those who've followed along here live, and or anyone out there catching up later. I really enjoy getting to reread a little bit of this stuff and share it with you. I hope that you'll share your knowledge too. Send in comments, correct me, send in questions, things you want to hear more about for our next meeting. That'll be in a couple weeks. First and third Mondays. We're here on Twitch, and see about getting these posted onto websites and YouTubes and all that good stuff another time. Thanks again. I'll sign off. Have a great couple weeks. Have fun reading.